booked and then come take my hand. We're rebels with a paperback plan.
Welcome to Booked and Banned, the podcast, where we discuss essential literature that has faced challenges and censorship. Today, we are stepping into 124 Bluestone Road to talk about Beloved by Toni Morrison. Our guest this week is a fellow Gen Xer whom I met when she lived in the greater DC area. Gal, welcome to the show. Please
Thank
tell
you.
our listeners a little bit about who you are.
Thanks, Naomi. Thanks for having me. I'm very honored. So, you invited me to be on your podcast and you shared your list of banned books with me and said, which one would you like to speak about? And it just was such an immediate response for me to speak about Beloved. The book just made such an impact on me when I first read it. And that was a really long time ago. You and I bonded on books right away, like the first time we met. And I remember you texted me and said, I'm so happy to have met another book person. So another fellow reader. Books have been a large part of our friendship and our sharing. Yeah, it's a book that I'd never read anything like it before, having been in middle and high school during the 80s, basically, and then college in the early 90s. I didn't read interesting books in high school. It was a lot of like dead white guys. And Beloved was just completely the opposite. And it just changed me. So this gave me the opportunity to reread it 30 years later and revisit, the everything that it is. So thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure. So let's put the book in context for our listeners. Set in the aftermath of the American Civil War, Beloved is a haunting masterpiece inspired by the true story of Margaret Garner. The novel follows Setha, a formerly enslaved woman living in a house in Cincinnati that is in the grip of a ghost or a demon. The spirit belongs to her first daughter, whom Setha killed as a toddler years prior to save her daughter from a life of slavery when Setha and her children were tracked down by their former captors. When a mysterious young woman named Beloved appears on the doorstep, the past becomes flesh. Morrison uses this supernatural framework to explore the shattering psychological legacy of slavery, the fierce and sometimes destructive power of maternal love, and the necessity of Setha's term rememory to heal individual and collective trauma. Beloved is the first in Morrison's trilogy about excesses of love. Mother love in Beloved, romantic love in Jazz, and self-love in Paradise. Despite winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1988 and being a staple of the American literary canon, Beloved consistently appears on the American Library Association's top 10 most challenged books list. This is a novel about the physical and spiritual scars of slavery, a story that asks if some memories are too heavy to carry, and more saliently, why so many people are still terrified of students reading it today. From political campaign ads to school board showdowns, the battle over this book is about much more than just words on a page. It's a battle over which parts of our history we are allowed to remember. And let me give you a short timeline. Right after its release, just began in high schools, notably in Kentucky and Georgia. This was mostly in the 90s, with parents claiming that the book was, quote, unsuited to the age group, unquote. In 2013, a high-profile case in Virginia involved a mother attempting to have the book removed from the AP English curriculum, claiming it gave her son nightmares. This later became a political flashpoint in the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial race. In the 2020s, the book has seen a resurgence in bans across Florida, Texas, and Utah, as part of broader movements to restrict literature dealing with critical race theory or, quote, divisive concepts, unquote. The reasons cited for banning Beloved usually fall into three categories. Critics often point to the book's raw depictions of sexual violence and bestiality, elements Morrison included to illustrate the dehumanization of enslaved people. The central act of infanticide and descriptions of the physical torture of enslaved people are frequently labeled, quote, too intense, unquote, for students. More recently, the book has been targeted by those who argue its depiction of institutionalized racism is, quote, shaming, unquote, to certain students or serves a specific political agenda. To supporters and educators, banning Beloved isn't just about removing a scary book. It is an attempt to look away from the brutal realities of American history. Morrison isn't writing shocking stories for the sake of it. She has given a voice to those whom history has tried to silence. So, Gal, Beloved is a profound work of literature, and I know you've already given us a synopsis of how you came to Beloved, but can you go into more detail about why you chose this book for today's episode and what about it resonates for you?
Yeah. So I first read Beloved 30 years ago in the fall of 1995. And the reason I remember that so vividly, besides the fact that it impacted me like a punch in the gut, like just, or a punch in the heart, is that I was on a little trip. I lived in California at the time, and I was taking a little solo trip into New York and DC. And I brought two books with me, and Beloved was one of them. I basically spent this 10-day trip reading. I went to cafes and read. I sat in the apartment I was staying in and read. I just didn't go anywhere without my book. And I remember staying up until all hours in this little studio apartment where I was staying in New York City, just reading till the end and just unable to put it down. And on that same trip, I was invited by a colleague of mine in California to hear Cornell West at the Harvard Club. She had gone to Harvard and somehow was involved in this event. So she said, "Oh, you're going to be in New York. You should come to this event." So I was like, great, I'll come. I don't think I even knew who Cornell West was at the time, I have to admit. So I show up in this kind of stodgy club and I walk in and I see Toni Morrison in the flesh at a table with some man with funny hair who turned out to be Cornell West. And my heart's racing and I'm looking around. I'm trying to find my friend. She's schmoozing with people. And I'm like, where am I going to sit? And only seat available in the whole entire room was at the table with Toni Morrison and Cornell West. So I very timidly sat myself down and I wanted to speak to them. I wanted to speak to her and tell her I had just read this book, but she's a big personality and regal and very intimidating. And I don't think I got the nerve. And they were speaking to each other. At some point I figured out that, oh, that's Cornell West that she's speaking to. And I'm going to just let them have their conversation and not be a fangirl. To like have just finished the book and then be sitting at the table with her was just so impactful. I never read anything like it before. I don't know that I've read anything quite like it since. It remains in my top favorite books ever, and was just an amazing experience to reread it so many years later.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. I've heard Toni Morrison speak, but I don't think I've ever been that close to her, which sounds amazing. So, in the novel, Paul D describes Setha's love for her children as, quote, too thick, unquote. A devotion so intense it becomes frightening to those around her. At the same time, we see the importance of other mothering, the way women in the community, like baby Suggs, provide care and spiritual guidance that extends beyond biological ties. How does Morrison challenge our usual ideas of what mothering is? And what does the book suggest about the necessity of a community in raising and protecting children?
That's a really good question. It's interesting because when I first read it, I wasn't a mother. And all these years later, I have been a mother for 22 years. And what jumps out at me first is that Paul D is almost envious and jealous of the love that Setha has for Beloved, for Denver, for her children, because it's like he can't quite reach that love from her. And it makes me think about when we love as mother, when I've loved my children as a mother, I've had to really understand that the love that we give them has to be about them and not about us, right? And which is not always easy because, there's a lot of baggage we bring to motherhood, I think. And the other mothering it's so vivid in Beloved. The way baby Suggs cares for Setha when she arrives with her little tiny baby Denver that she's delivered in the woods, and cleans her wounds from the whippings on her back, and cleans her swollen feet. And she's not her mother, right? She's kind of in this strange way like a mother-in-law, but obviously in very complicated circumstances because they're enslaved. But it's such a loving, mothering way of caring. And even when Seth is in the woods and she's getting help to deliver her baby from this white girl, all one word, right? White girl named Amy, who could at any moment betray her, but ends up helping her. There's some other mothering happening in a kind of uncomfortable way, right? Because she's one rung on the ladder higher than Setha because she's white, but she's obviously poor and doesn't have any freedom of her own. And then near the end, where the community of women come, and they're the ones who end up banishing Beloved Ghost essentially away and rescuing Setha and Denver from Beloved's ghost. And these are women who have been afraid to connect with her for so many years, but they rally and they mother that way. So I just feel like there's so many examples of that
Yeah. And
in the story.
I think one other example, even though it's a small one, is Paul D himself when he comes back to take care of Setha. And at night when Denver is going to be in town taking care of the Quakers, the Quaker family that gave them the house. I think there was a line about Paul D, and I'm not going to get it quite correctly, but there's a gentleness in him. And it was something about how women could just let themselves go when they were in the presence of Paul D, because there was some quality about him where they felt safe, right? And so I think he's also, or is about to become, an other mother in this story as well. And it's kind of a beautiful, beautiful ending. So Toni Morrison's writing is often described as lyrical or even symphonic. And, because I have heard her speak, I've never listened to an audiobook, and I know that you have, that she narrates herself. And she's got this rich voice, but I've just heard her speak. And so sometimes when I'm reading her work, I can hear her voice in my head as though I am listening to an audiobook, because she just always made such a distinct impression on me. And there's this scene where Setha and Hallie are going into the cornfield because they think that that's being more discreet to have sex for the first time on their quote unquote wedding night. And they're in the corn, and their activity is shaking the corn. And the other slaves, who are all men, are they're just having dinner, like making potatoes and eating corn. And the line it's talking about the corn, but it says, "How sweet the silk, how jailed down the juice." I don't even know what that means, but when you're reading it, you know what that means. And it's not really about the corn. There's a lot of that in Toni Morrison's work. But is there a specific quote or passage that you selected to share with us? What about those specific words in that passage feel so moving or essential to you?
She has this way with words where it feels like she's channeling something. I'm like, like that, I'm imagining her at her typewriter, which is probably a typewriter in the 80s when she wrote it, right? Or her early word processor, just kind of these words flowing out of her, like you said, I never would have put words like that together. And listening this time that I read it last month, I both read and listened to it. I'd listen to a bit and then I'd read a little bit. Sometimes I'd read along while I was listening to it. And hearing her do the voices differently was just so cool because she really does have different voices. And when she's reading, you really feel the characters. And I can still hear that voice. It's really quite amazing. The passage that stands out specifically is near the end, and it's this little chapter. I had to actually read and listen to that one because I was like, wait, who's speaking here? And the whole point is she goes from Setha to Beloved to Denver, and it's just switches between them. It's intention. There's no punctuation, and there's no quotes, so you don't know. You kind of can't quite figure out who's talking, and I think that's the point. Is that they become so entangled with each other. At least that's the interpretation I gave. That, and she starts by distinguishing the voices when she's reading, but then kind of mixes them up because as you're reading, you realize the whole point is that they're so interconnected, and Setha's pain and trauma is so entangled in the fact that she's been raising Denver after having had to basically end the life of the child who came before Denver, and the process of becoming free and escaping. There's so much entanglement there that it just blew me away. I had to reread that passage multiple times because at the end I had to pause the audiobook and I literally said a verbal oof, wow. And again, I've never read anything like that. I don't think I'd ever read anything that doesn't have punctuation or distinction between characters, but you get who's talking, but then you get that the point is that you're not supposed to understand who's talking after a certain point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all of them, I
Yeah,
think. And
exactly.
becomes this kind of concerto of voices. So she uses a ghost or a demon to represent the trauma of slavery. How do you think the quote unquote horror elements of the book, The Haunting of 124 Bluestone Road, help readers understand the psychological impact of slavery in a way that a standard historical narrative might not?
Right. I read a lot of magical realism in college because I studied Latin American history, and there's a lot of magical realism in the fiction of that place and time. In Beloved, it really serves as such a tool, and especially in that kind of horror element. I don't think of Beloved as a horror book, but there are absolutely those horror elements. And the core horror in Beloved is the enslavement, the fact that we enslaved human beings and brutalized human beings. And there's so much violence in the story, and there's so much violence in the trauma of the story. I think Beloved as a character is simultaneously intensely needy and also intensely frightening. And that's such an interesting juxtaposition, right? The horror is what makes people want to ban the book, right? The horror that is giving this teenager nightmares in AP literature is the horror that is real, right? Toni Morrison isn't depicting something out of her imagination. She may have created these characters, but these stories happened so many times, right? So the piece of Setha having to literally murder her child in order to save that child from enslavement. It's not horror to me. It's deeply traumatic and painful, and I mean, I don't even know the word. It's like I can't even imagine. And I remember being so struck by trying to put myself in her shoes when I first read it 30 years ago. Could I do that? Would I, and that to her, the horror of relinquishing that child to a lifetime of slavery was worse.
Well, and the horror of having to make that hard choice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
it slays me.
I,
A major theme in the book is, quote, rememory, unquote. the idea that past events exist as physical spaces we can stumble back into. How do you see Setha and the other characters navigating the need to remember their past with the profound need to move forward and heal?
That I think is the core of the story, right? Is that she's carrying all this trauma, and how do you metabolize that trauma while also trying to move forward? How, and you need to metabolize the trauma in order to move forward, but you also need to move forward in order to metabolize the trauma. Beloved is like the haunting of the trauma, kind of, right? The metaphor is like she's being haunted by beloved because she's being haunted by not just her own experience, but her generational like lineage of enslaved people and people who were taken from Africa and put on ships and some died. There's so many layers of trauma there. And the rememory is that's how you heal. When I think about my own experiences that have been difficult and traumatic in my own life, there's such healing in a story, in being able to share a story. Like when someone dies and people say, I'm so sorry for your loss. And then they say nothing more because they're afraid. They're afraid to reawaken the loss. And what feels better when you've lost someone you love than to have someone ask about that person so you can rememory them and tell their story. And, I think people are afraid, right? They're so afraid of asking the wrong question that they don't ask. And I think in the retelling is where the healing is. And getting back to the book banning, we can't heal from our traumatic national story of having this dark, dark stain of slavery as part of our story. And we're never going to heal from it because we're not talking about it. We're like, this is not a book that's appropriate to teach. Well, actually, we have to. When I talk to my kids about difficult things, we go there and we recognize that we're going to difficult places, and we keep age appropriate, obviously, but I think it's actually very healing, both on an individual level and a generational level, but also on a national level, to like, let's read these books and discuss the opposite of the Gone with the Wind story of the happy slave and the kind, benevolent slave owner and the dancing mammy in the kitchen. There's just so much pain, and it's in the rememory that we can heal it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's not much to say beyond that. We have to be able to talk about these things. And that's where censorship is getting in the way of it. So while this novel is sometimes described as a ghost story, it's also a story about the resilience of the human spirit. What is one final thought or takeaway you want to leave our listeners with regarding Beloved and its place in our lives today?
I think it is a not only necessary thing to read a book like Beloved and have these conversations, it's courageous and critical and so rewarding. As a white person, I have different generational trauma. This is not my generational trauma, but the thing about books is you get to feel another person's, like, it's like a true test of empathy, right? You get to experience what it might be like to be another person and live another life. What greater gift is that? I'm so grateful I read this book. I'm so grateful I reread this book. I'm sure I will reread it again, maybe in another 30 years, hopefully not that long. But it's such a generous gift from Toni Morrison and from the ancestors who spoke through her in telling that story, because I really do feel like she was channeling something bigger than herself. And I think we all do, right? We all carry our ancestors with us. And in telling those stories, that's how we keep them with us.
Toni Morrison also said, if there's a story you want to read, you must write it. And so this is the story she wrote because there was nothing else out there for her to read quite like it. Thank you so much for coming on Booked and Banned to talk about Beloved. Our next episode will be a discussion of The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today. As Isaac Asimov said, any book worth banning is a book worth reading.
Booked and banned and bound by pages, stories hiding through the ages, whispered truths that still ring clear for those who choose to listen here. Booked and banned, we take a stand, turning words into common ground. Booked and banned, come take my hand, we're rebels with a paperback